Hello and welcome to today's show for Saturday, November 6th of the Manhattan Project. What you've just seen is an advertisement for a conference that will be happening and will be shown at this location for the Schiller Institute. And it will be a conference that will be happening over 2 days. You've just seen something on the panels. And actually, what we're going to do is go directly to a discussion that happened between Helga LaRouche, the founder and chairman of the Schiller Institute, with Harley Schlanger, who's going to be speaking with us in just a few minutes about the developments of the past week internationally. But we'll go first to this clip from Helga and Harley's discussion, which happened a couple of days ago.
Now, we're going to be having another Schiller Institute conference coming up on November 13th and 14th, which will be introducing to people again this concept of the coincidence of opposites. What's scheduled for this conference?
Oh, this conference will be super important. I can only invite you, all our viewers and listeners, to absolutely reserve the time. It's on the 13th and 14th of November. It will have 4 panels. We already have lined up very, very important speakers from Russia, from China, from the United States, from Europe. The first panel will deal with the strategic crisis. I think the title somehow is, can a conflict between the superpowers still be avoided? And this obviously has such crisis spots like Taiwan, increasing tensions around potential war between the US and China over Taiwan, then the same thing over the Ukraine with Russia. And in general, the strategic situation, which is an incredible, dangerous point right now. So that will be extremely important. You will not get such open discussion. And many of the participants and speakers of previous conferences have said again and again that they regard the Schiller Institute as an absolutely unique platform for such a dialogue to occur. Because as you may have noticed, the mainstream media are pretty much what you called during the Nazi period gleichgeschaltet, completely unified and not allowing really an opposing view. For example, if you say that there are tons of scientists who claim that the data of the IPCC are not correct, you are being already eliminated from the media. There is complete dictatorship in the media, increasingly also in the social media. So this platform is very important because you have top-level people from many countries who speak openly about these issues. So this is a must to look at. And the second panel is on the economic breakdown, hyperinflation, but also such situations as the breakdown of entire continents, countries, Afghanistan, Haiti, the drug problem, the explosion of the prices. Then we have a third panel on the question of the science of climate. We will have tons of very, very important scientists, fusion, thermonuclear fusion energy, space cooperation. So this will be very optimistic because it shows you where to go. And then the fourth panel will be on the cultural demise of the West and what to do about it, namely to have a dialogue of cultures and a cultural renaissance of classical cultures and the best traditions around the world. So this will be beautiful. I will put out very soon the more concrete program. In the meantime, you can find the invitation on our website. You should register. You should get it to all of your friends and enjoy and look forward to an enjoyable, very creative weekend.
Now, after a long, long week at COP26, basically the verdict that's right now in on that conference, this is the conference, the so-called climate change conference that's been going on in Scotland. The verdict, I guess, that one could pass on that is that having failed to have induced the world to commit suicide, British imperial and other financial forces are now trying to go directly to homicide. That is an important element of what we want to reveal about the nature of that conference. Some viewers have not understood its nature. Some people think it's only about global warming. But again, there was a conversation that was had between Harley and Helga that described the actual character of the agenda of that conference. That conference does continue, by the way, be going on all next week, and actually will be concluding just the day before the November 13th and 14th conference. So we want to say a little bit here about how that conference began to decompose even as it began last week, what its actual nature was. Take a look.
Now, you mentioned that Biden has not gotten things passed. He was at the COP26 conference empty handed because he had no legislative victory for infrastructure, for the Green New Deal, but he did go there and attack Russia and China. How did that go over?
Well, that was not exactly a wise thing to do because, given the absolute confrontation line coming from the US, the UK, the EU, NATO against Russia and China, well, I mean, I'm pretty sure that there are intelligent people in both countries who recognize the self-destructive character of this Green Deal. And, why should they interfere and have these Western countries dismantle their own economies? Maybe they're just looking at it to see how they self-destruct. I mean, the attacks are also completely unfounded, and this was noted by former UN Deputy General Secretary Pino Arlacchi, who commented in an Italian blog that the fact that China is the largest emitter of CO2 should surprise nobody because they have become the largest economy by now. And if you look at the emissions of the United States 20 years ago, they were the largest, in quote, sinner in respect to CO2 emissions. So I think a lot of this debate is completely ludicrous, and one can already say now that the COP26 can be probably called Flop 26. And, Russia was not there. China, India said that they will have climate neutrality by 2070. That's 50 years from now. And, I think that the entire goal, which was pronounced by Charles and Sir Attenborough, a really hardcore advocate of depopulation, I mean, they said incredible things there. One should not be at ease about it. What Prince Charles said is he called for a military-style implementation of basically a policy which goes beyond governments, which should be implemented globally by the private sector. I mean, this absolutely confirms what we put out in our brochure, The Great Reset, where we warned that these people are intending to implement a global fascist dictatorship with an absolute aggressive program of depopulation, because that's the consequences of what they are proposing. And Prince Charles said it, and also Sir Attenborough said it. He said the fewer people who are on the planet, a planet with finite resources, the better. I mean, this is just totally stupid, because the whole thesis about the limits to growth on the planet, I mean, this was a fraud when the Club of Rome and the Dennis Meadows and Forrester came out with it in 72, because it was based on a computer model which completely left out the redefinition of what raw materials are through scientific and technological progress. And Lyndon LaRouche, my late husband, wrote a very important book against that at the time, called There Are No Limits to Growth. But this Malthusian lie is continuously trotted out, And obviously, these people want to eliminate scientific and technological progress and turn history back to a time before the industrialization, back to the Middle Ages and the population levels which existed then. But I think that has been recognized by Russia, by China, by India. India said many times that, if there is a climate problem, it was caused by the so-called advanced countries, and they should take care of it, and not the developing countries. One should not underestimate that the power of coercion coming from this crowd, this royal family and their cohorts, is nevertheless very big. For example, they forced South Africa to accept a deal whereby they get a miserable $8 billion for making the commitment to move out of coal. So I'm not downplaying the meanness and the almost satanic intention of these policies, but they're also not very successful. And if the West is so stupid to continue to self-implement these policies, they are destroying themselves. And that, I think, has been understood by many forces around the world.
There'll be more about this from Harley in a moment, but the issue that confronts us is, have the world elites, so-called elites, lost the ability to think? And if so, do the people of the world know how to think to replace those failed institutions, leaders, and cultures with real ideas which allow for durable human survival? In fact, what is the very nature of ideas anyway? Lyndon LaRouche explained that in a Schiller Institute presentation. Take a look.
What the Greeks mean by an idea, and the difference between the archaic art represents a sense perception. The Greek classical art, or the paintings by Raphael or Leonardo da Vinci, represent ideas. There's a difference. One is an image based on the senses, which is what you get on television, isn't it? Television entertainment is based on no ideas, but sense perception, blood, violence, and sex. Right? You see it, you feel it, you sense it. That's real. Right? But it's not. Whereas an idea is something else. The term idea means a principle. For example, the common case of a principle is a scientific principle. The idea of gravity. Did you ever see a gravity? Did you ever actually feel one? No, you didn't. You thought you did. You didn't. Did you ever see a principle of nature? You ever shake hands with it? Smell it? Lick it? Touch it? Sniff it? Huh? No, you didn't. But these are ideas, and they are valid, and they tell us something. They tell us the principles that control the universe. Something you can't smell, you can't see, you can't touch, you can't lick it, you can't taste it, and yet it controls the universe. It's called a principle. It's called an idea. All art, great art, is based on ideas, which have nothing to do directly with the senses. Artistic ideas come from contradictions in the senses. As classical art comes from dissonance, from contradictions, from the development of forcing you to find an idea, to find an irony, a metaphor, an idea. Scientific principle, ideas. Now let's look at this. This is where we get to the part about the difference between monkeys and people. Next one. There are 4 steps to forming an idea. And I've reduced it to the form which occurs in science. In science you have, as we have this contradiction, this ontological paradox, this difference between the image of an economy from the standpoint of money, from the standpoint of financial accounting, which is fraudulent. Yeah? But they still collect bills on that day. Then you have the other conception of the economy, which is based on physical production and things which are essential to physical production, such as education, healthcare, and science services. So you have 2 images of the economy. The fact that the 2 somehow intersect means that there's an irony here, there's a contradiction, there's a metaphor. You've got to explain that metaphor to understand how an economy works. Oh, there's another thing. is that to have a principle in so-called physics, or mathematical physics, called entropy, which says, in effect, that any mechanical system will run down. Now, if an economy is a mechanical system, and all financial accounting is based on mechanics, the principles of mechanical interaction, how can you have a financial system which generates a profit? How can it? Every system, mechanical system, if it continues long enough, runs down. Now, if something runs down, how does it produce more? Every mechanical system always produces less. Therefore, by definition, no economy which corresponds perfectly to a financial accounting system could possibly have a profit. And yet, if we look at the history of mankind, we find that mankind, whose potential population density on this planet, as approximating that of an ape, was only never more than 3 million people on this planet. If mankind were an ape, which is what Prince Philip claims to be, then at no time could there have been more than several million living human individuals on this planet. In the past 2 million years of the Ice Age. At no time. That's the ecological potential of an ape, or an ape-type species. How do we get to several hundred million people, living individuals on this planet, during the medieval period? How do we get to 5 billion people on this planet recently? Obviously, we're not apes. Obviously, we grow. This growth in population depended upon technological progress of various kinds, also artistic progress. Man's increased power over nature. It depended upon the growth of income, standard of living, lessening morbidity rates. You can't educate a child at the age of 25 if the parents are dying of morbidity rates at the age of 30 to 35, can you? You can't maintain such a society. Therefore, there had to be more, there had to be improvement, there had to be increase. This is no entropic system. This is no mechanical system. This is no financial accounting system. It doesn't explain anything. There's some source of some increase of man's power over nature which intersects the process of production which accounts for this process.
So reality is governed by the scientific principles conveyed through physical economy to ever larger numbers of people as a whole. And this has been the distinctive contribution of Lyndon LaRouche and his many different organizations, his many different political campaigns, and also of the Schiller Institute, and will be the subject of that conference. But now to discuss how that principle intersects what people like to call current events, current politics, strategy, tactics, etc. We're going to have Harley Schlanger, who has been on our platform many, many times. He's over there in Europe right now, and he's going to give you a kind of a tour de horizon of what's been happening and how to think about what's happening. We're going to have some questions shortly after his presentation. And I think you're going to find that there'll be some shocking, surprising, and striking ideas that are going to arrive and emerge from this conversation. So, Harley, glad to see you. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis. I want to begin by taking up on the point that Helga was making about why this conference that's coming up is so important. That this will be, as she said, a beautiful conference, because it will give people or provide people the means by which to do what Lyndon LaRouche was discussing, forming ideas that are based on principle rather than our manipulations of emotion. Most of what it passes for political discourse in the United States and in Western Europe today is based on emotional manipulation that's run by the very people who have run the system into the ground and are now asking nations to give up their sovereignty so their people will be forced to commit suicide, rather than actually moving the way civilization should move toward new platforms based on discoveries in science and technology. So this conference coming up it's occurring in a specific moment of history, but to understand it, really what's going on around you today, it's very helpful to look at the history of Lyndon LaRouche and our organization and how we've been able to pull together these conferences, which include many leaders from countries around the world, from institutions around the world, including different races, different nationalities, but people who are focused on this question of how do you advance the human race. Now, let me begin by discussing an example of a devolution of the human race, namely the Glasgow Climate Conference, which I started calling several weeks ago the COP26. Now, as Helge mentioned, in his presentation, President Biden attacked China for not being there and similarly criticized Russia by saying they missed an opportunity to play a role. And then he said, but it was important that he was there, that he had a great impact on the conference. Now, I wonder who told him that. The Biden presence was pretty much insignificant in the broader shape of things, which behind the scenes was being run by what you might say the people who would have told Biden that it was important that he was there. But the people who are making the policy, from the City of London, from Wall Street, from leading oligarchical institutions, and I want to go through some of that, but let me start by just telling you some things that came up in the last day as this summit is continuing. First, you had a headline story in Bloomberg News. Bloomberg, of course, is owned by Sir Michael Bloomberg, who's one of the key figures, along with former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, in shaping the anti-growth depopulation agenda of COP26. Bloomberg News had a headline today: China's deafening silence speaks loudest at Glasgow. This expresses their freak out that the Chinese aren't there. China is the world's second largest economy. It may be increasingly becoming the leading influential government on the planet because the Chinese are actually doing things to help other countries develop, as opposed to signing on to the climate accords, which are denying nations the right to develop. So the fact that they say the deafening silence speaks loudest is an indication of their panic that China has not agreed to go along with the COP26 policies. Second headline: Russia's dirty gas is keeping Europe from freezing over. Now, interestingly, this is a true story. This headline is true because Europe is dependent increasingly on gas from Russia because of its idiotic policies of the European Union, shutting down nuclear, moving away from coal, moving away from fossil fuels, because the European Union is one of the initiating forces behind the COP26 summit. But the reality is that without Russia, and also I would say without trade from China, the economy of the nations of Europe would be in a total downward spiral. Now, while these fears and the recognition of the importance of Russia were evidenced in these headlines, what was happening from the leaders of the climate conference? Well, there was a press conference held by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, and now one of the top officials at the United Nations in charge of the climate, with Michael Bloomberg, one of the leading funders of the anti-coal movement and a push to force nations to stop investing, not only in fossil fuel, but in physical production. They had a press conference and they announced that 450 major financial institutions have signed on to an agreement, which they're calling the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. One of my colleagues said, I guess they've become netsies. This Financial Alliance for Net Zero is what? It's an agreement that there will be no funding for fossil fuels, for coal, probably for nuclear, although we'll see what happens with that. And that instead there will be these 450 financial institutions, insurance companies, and so on, have control assets of more than $130 trillion, which they're saying will be put into the transition away from the present economy to the so-called sustainable economy of the COP26 conference. To make sure that happens, that nations who sign an agreement at the end of the Glasgow conference stick to it and stop investments in these areas, they've established a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. The important thing about this task force is it will establish guidelines for mandatory climate risk disclosures. And the question is, will this be enforced? That's what Prince Charles meant when he talked about declaring war on the existing economy. There are enforcement operations that have been set up under the auspices of the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury to police investments so that, assuming this goes through, people like Prince Charles, people like Klaus Schwab of Davos, Carney and others will have a printout of the investments that are being made and will be able to start Xing out investments to fossil fuels. But it's not just fossil fuels, it's construction, concrete companies, steel companies. It goes into agriculture. The efforts to reduce agriculture to sustainable agriculture, which has basically been the International Monetary Fund policy towards Africa for years, where they'll finance hoes and rakes, but nothing that can actually increase the agricultural productivity of a nation. So what Glasgow demonstrates, what's coming out of it, demonstrates what we've identified going back some months ago, actually some years ago, I should say, as the strategy of the global oligarchy, as their system is collapsing. And that strategy is the imposition from the top of a global institution of central banks that are operated by the private banks and financial institutions to merge the green policy with the Great Reset, to carry out a Shaktian transformation of the economy. And by Shaktian, essentially what it means is the corporate cartels will determine spending policy, investment policy, and at this point, those policies require the move to the lower energy flux density forms of electricity production, which will not sustain a population of 8 billion people on the planet. Now, this was denounced by LaRouche famously in a December 1971 debate with a leading social democrat named Abba Lerner. Some of you may be familiar with this, where Lerner admitted that his policies were Shaktian policies. This was after the famous August 15, 1971 decision by the Nixon administration to end the Bretton Woods system, to remove the gold reserve backing of the dollar, and establishing the floating exchange rate that led to the massive increase in speculation that's gone over the last 50 years to higher and higher levels. At the same time, reducing the investment in physical economy. So this is the Shaktian policy that Abba Lerner said, had Germany adopted it, they wouldn't have needed Hitler. Well, the German governments didn't adopt it. In fact, they were looking toward what was going on in the United States, looking toward an investment policy in real economy, when the decision was made to put Hitler in power. And that decision was not made by German voters. Hitler never got more than 33 or 34% of the vote. It was made by the oligarchs, centered around the 120 Broadway operations of the synarchists in the United States, the Harrimans, the Rockefellers, and others, in collaboration with Sir Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England, and their German corporate conglomerate partners. They put Hitler in power because they intended to carry out an austerity policy that would have money going into war preparations, but would be slave labor for the population. That's what LaRouche was denouncing, and that's what we've seen as a policy initially toward the developing sector, and now this will be enforced on the so-called advanced sector. Now, simultaneous to this, we have the COP26, or simultaneous, I'm sorry, to the COP26, we see the escalation against Russia and China, not just denouncing them for not participating in the conference, but escalation around Taiwan, with the Biden administration saying that the US would come to the defense of Taiwan if there were an attack from China, then backing away from that, and yet sending out signals so that the president of Taiwan said, we expect the US would intervene. And at the same time, you have the buildup of naval forces in the region and the so-called Asian NATO coming into existence around the Quad and forces from Germany and the United Kingdom. You have the AUKUS agreement to have a US, UK, Australian escalation against China based on providing nuclear submarines to the Australians. Now, at the same time, you also have an escalation against Russia over Ukraine, where the Russians are trying to get an agreement with Ukraine to stick to the accords that were adopted, the so-called Minsk Accords, the Normandy framework. Ukraine won't do it. In fact, Ukraine wants to be integrated into NATO. Why? Because they say Russia's about to invade them. Russia's about to storm into the Baltic states and so on. Nonsense. Completely illogical from a Russian standpoint, and yet the basis for a military buildup in the NATO countries, and of course being used to advance the idea of more money for the military-industrial complex in the United States. Now, it even went so far as some discussion from leading officials that the U.S. has an outdated military plan toward Russia and China, which is that the U.S. should be prepared to fight one of them at a time. Now they're saying that's outdated. We have to be prepared to fight both of them because of the military integration going on between Russia and China. That's not a full military integration, but what is it? It's a recognition that the two of them are being targeted by the proponents of a unipolar world, even as that unipolar world is collapsing, as we saw in the fiasco at the end of the war in Afghanistan. 20 years of Americans deployed to fight a war there, supposedly to build a nation, and what happened? It's now collapsed. Now, there are other aspects of this. Going along with this is global hyperinflation, which we had forecast going back especially to the aftermath of the 2008 crash, when instead of putting financial corporations into financial bankruptcy reorganization, which should have been done, which LaRouche called for, canceling some of the debt and having these investment banks and these large commercial banks eat the losses, and the commercial banks protected under the Roosevelt policy of the FDIC and others, but the speculators eating their losses. Instead, there was a new round of speculation based on money coming from the Federal Reserve and other global central banks. And this led to a new collapse, which became evident in September 2019, the so-called repurchasing agreements, which required 10, 20, 30, 50, sometimes $150 billion a night to roll over debt to avoid defaults. That preceded the COVID crisis. People who are saying the current economic downturn is based on COVID are wrong. It's based on the failure to address the cause of the 2008 collapse and the continuation of those policies, including quantitative easing and bailouts on steroids, to the point that the whole system was overwhelmed by unpayable debt. And the idea is that you have to keep pumping money into it. And so they predicted eventually, the Federal Reserve said, well, there's going to be transitory inflation. And we said it's not transitory. That's like being a little pregnant. And the reality now is that they're admitting it's going to be at least 2 years. That's what Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, said. Others are saying it's sustainable inflation, that it's not going away. And it not only eats away at savings and living standards, but it adds to the destruction of what's left of our physical economy. Now, the energy crisis is a part of this. Have we run out of coal? Have we run out of oil and gas? The Russians have promised Europe that they'll pump as much natural gas as necessary. No, the Green New Deal and this Glasgow agreement to stop funding fossil fuel exploration is what's driving speculation. So the prices for energy are going through the roof. Pretty soon you'll have to mortgage your house to get money to fill your gas tank if this continues. And then you add to this the COVID pandemic. This confirms another one of LaRouche's forecasts, where he pointed out years ago in wealthy countries, the policies of privatization of healthcare, the drastic cuts in public health, and the blank check given to big pharma was going to destroy the healthcare system. The US had the Hill-Burton Act, which defined a minimum standard for number of beds necessary in hospitals per 100,000 people. That collapsed. That was deliberately shut down for the idea of just-in-time economics. Well, what happens when you have a pandemic with just-in-time healthcare? You're not prepared. You don't have the ICUs. You don't have the doctors. You don't have the nurses. Now, there were efforts to ramp this up quickly. The best one was in China, where they built hospitals in less than a week to handle the numbers of people who were testing positive. In the United States, it took a while, but we did ramp it up a bit. We had the vaccine developed in a rapid pace. And yet, what we're seeing is an exhaustion of the existing healthcare system. As doctors are leaving, nurses are leaving, hospitals can't handle the numbers. And they're talking about a new wave, whether this is the fourth wave that's hitting Europe. I don't know whether it's the third or fourth wave in the United States, but we haven't solved it yet because there's not a commitment to protect and defend human life, either in the advanced countries or in the areas where we're going to see more variations emerge, that is the poorer countries which have almost no healthcare system. Now, all of these things have created a lack of trust in governments, in public officials, obviously in the media, because the media has been the biggest spewer of lies on the planet. And this lack of trust, combined with the policies, the financial policies, have created the deepest crisis that we've ever faced. And to go back to the strategic crisis, let me just emphasize that we could be sleepwalking into war with the policies that are being enunciated by leading figures when it comes to dealing with China and Russia. Now, it's become increasingly obvious to more people that they see that there are evil forces controlling the narratives and controlling the policies. Whether you call it the deep state, the corporate cartels, the shadow government, the cabal of corruption that we saw around Russiagate. But most people are pessimistic that they can be beaten. And I get emails every single day in response to my updates with people saying, well, how can you beat them? Now, you have to keep in mind one thing that I think is really important. And I'm using this word scientifically. How devilishly clever this deep state network actually thinks they are. And let me give you an example. The Virginia election. Now, this was portrayed as shocking. Less than or 1 year after Biden's victory, his alleged victory over Trump, what happens? You have a turnaround. The suburbs, which went for Biden in 2020, now went for a Republican who was endorsed by Donald Trump. And so the media was playing this as a big victory for Trump. Trump supporters were ecstatic. But there's one problem that people didn't get. Who is Glenn Youngkin? He's an interface of the Bush machine, the rhinos, and Wall Street. The war party, the military-industrial complex, the very institutions that were attacked ferociously and correctly by Donald Trump in his 2016 campaign. Those people who are Trump supporters who are seeing this as a vindication of 2020 and saying that this is the triumph of Trump, Take a look at who this guy is. After college, he went to First Boston, which is one of the leading banks in the global cartels. Then he went to McKinsey and Associates, which has been involved in turning out all kinds of, has been at the center of the whole speculative system. And then from there, he went to the Carlyle Group. Let me remind you what the Carlyle Group is. This was a buyout operation that was set up similar to Bain Capital of Mitt Romney. Now, he didn't just go to the Carlyle Group. He joined their buyout team in 1995 and worked there until 2000. What were they buying out? Among the firms were consulting firms and defense firms that they were involved in pulling private equity funds in to take them over. Then where did he go? He went to London. Youngkins lived in London from 2000 to 2005, leading Carlyle's buyout team in the United Kingdom. Not exactly the profile of a loyal Trumper. This is the Bush political machine. It's Wall Street, it's the City of London, it's the military industrial complex, it's the very kind of private equity firm that's part of the financial operation going into the Great Reset. Now, the media focused on a Republican candidate in Virginia winning an election where the Republicans hadn't won recently by winning back the suburbs, and that these were the suburbs that had gone to Biden in 2020, and now they're back in the Republican Party. Well, who are the people in these suburbs? There's no question that the rural voters and the loyal Trump supporters voted against Terry McAuliffe because he was a terrible guy. McAuliffe was part of the Clinton machine at the top. And we know personally what McAuliffe's role was to try and keep the LaRouche organization from taking over the Democratic Party in the early 2000s. But who voted in these suburbs for Youngkins? Well, who lives in the Northern Virginia suburbs? Military industrial complex employees, rhino Republicans, independent voters who swing based on the media narrative. So that's when you look at this thing, I'm bringing this up because you asked the question, why bring it up? Well, how did people get manipulated by this? This is how it works. What Lyndon LaRouche emphasized is that in order to win the kind of fight that we've been in for the last 50 years, and if you look at LaRouche's history, it's more than 50 years that he's identified these networks and exposed them and offered alternatives to them. What did he say we need to do? First, know your enemy. Your enemy is not some vague liberal or a pencil-neck socialist teaching at a university. Your enemy is the leading financial networks that fund both parties in the United States and that are the supporters of the endless war policy and the endless austerity policy to tear down the institutions of government which do function in things such as infrastructure. Once you know your enemy, you must know their history. Learn how they think. What is their intention? We've just laid that out in terms of what the Great Reset and the Green New Deal are, to reduce the world's population. They say it openly. Prince Charles is a longtime advocate of the idea that there are too many people. His father, Prince Philip, said he wanted to come back if he could be reincarnated as a deadly virus to kill off people. Henry Kissinger in 1974-75 produced a document, National Security Study Memo 200, which called for depopulation, for the US to use food as a weapon to reduce population in, I think they identified 13 countries, mostly African and Asian and South American countries. So you have to know what their intention is. That's their intention. It's not to impose some kind of socialism or communist regime. It's a banker's dictatorship. The bankers are not communists. They're predatory capitalists. And then the third thing you need to know, which goes back to this clip we saw of LaRouche about what an idea is, you have to learn what they know about how you think so they can manipulate you. And that's an important aspect of the work that we're doing, the intelligence work we at the LaRouche movement do every single day. Now, how do they do this? They use polarizing issues, whether it's race, gender, the idea of mandates versus personal freedom. You have to look at what you're missing in the big picture when you get whipped up on these other issues. That's not to say that what's being said about race or gender or these things are right or good, but they have a higher purpose. You know, I really don't think that Prince Charles cares how many bathrooms you have to account for all the 50-something sexes they claim they've discovered. What he cares about is that you're going to be arguing endlessly about these questions while they're killing you with the carbon mandates and with the endless wars that they're going to continue to run. So, and let me give you an example, because what we're dealing with is people get their emotions themselves tied into knots over deliberately created divisive positions. Take the example of what happened in 2009, 2010. Most people did not like Obamacare, despite the fact they were told it's going to give them health care. And most people despised the bailouts, where the bankers were being bailed out and homeowners were losing their homes by the millions. Those were the biggest issues at the time, the bailout and Obamacare. Now, if you look at it, there were two big groups that emerged to fight this. One was Occupy Wall Street, and the other was the Tea Party. If you went to a rally on Obamacare or against the bailout, you'd see people from both of these groups, but they'd be arguing with each other, fighting with each other. What did they have in common? They opposed Obamacare, which was a fraudulent policy designed to increase the funds for private hospitals and insurance companies while stealing necessary medical capabilities, destroying your health, setting up literally these death panels. Both sides opposed that. And both sides also opposed the bailout. But instead of uniting, they were fighting. They were divided. Now, two things to know today in getting in this, looking at this battle. First, Prince Charles, Klaus Schwab, and others, they are desperate. This is not a big victory for them, what's happening at Glasgow. It is flop 26. There are many countries that are nodding their heads in agreement, even as they're saying they're not going to implement the mandates because they don't want to kill their populations. And that makes the people running this desperate, because we're in a systemic collapse. They are not so powerful unless we submit. And here's the point of that is that those in the United States and Western Europe who oppose these policies, who are your greatest allies in the world right now? Russia, China, perhaps India, many developing sector countries who most people in the advanced sector don't see as their allies. In fact, they're told that Russia's a bully, China's authoritarian, these developing sector countries are overpopulated. Well, look at who's telling you these things and figure that out. It's the desperation of the oligarchy which is shaping the narratives which are being pumped your way. And by narratives, I don't just mean in the mainstream media, but the narratives are also all over the internet that are designed to divide the population. The second thing you need to know is that we, the Schiller Institute, the LaRouche organization, have a tested program that would work to get us out of this collapse, to revive the physical economy. It's a tested program that began its tests in the first George Washington administration, when Alexander Hamilton, as Treasury Secretary, destroyed the British Empire's free trade policy that was trying to prevent the United States from developing a federal system that was based on physical production, infrastructure, raising living standards, and science. That worked 250 years ago after our revolution to get us out of debt. It worked again spectacularly with the Lincoln Revolution, which largely took place after his death, but was based on policies that he implemented during his presidency. It was there in the New Deal, which was not some socialist redistribution program, but which was the marshaling of credit policies through such institutions as Reconstruction Finance Corporation to build a nation. And it would work again today with the update of this with Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws. This is what we'll be discussing next Saturday and Sunday. And it won't just be people from the LaRouche organization, but our allies from all sorts of other institutions who come to our conferences because we actually allow deliberation. We allow dialogue. We don't accept politically correct cant coming from a bunch of blowhards. We insist that there be serious discussion. And this is something which is appreciated all over the world. I can tell you from calls I've been getting from Pakistan, from Iran, from Italy, people who are interested, from Russia, who are interested in participating because they know that they can come to our conferences and actually have an honest, serious discussion. And so I would urge you, if you've been listening to what I've been saying about the situation in the world, the danger to humanity if these oligarchs are allowed to continue in power. But the fact that they're weak, we have a potential, we have allies all over the world, including a growing potential movement in the United States and Western Europe. But it needs a program. It needs principled ideas of the sort Lyndon LaRouche spoke about in the clip you saw at the beginning of this program today. And so I'd urge you, go to the schillerinstitute.com website and register for the conference and register your friends and do what you can to share it. If you have a platform, you can live stream it. We'll work that out with you. But this is the moment where our forces have to come forward and not be manipulated. So let me stop at that, and I think we should probably have some questions.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Harley. And if you're just joining us, today's program is devoted to getting you on board organizing for the conference Harley just alluded to, which is entitled All Moral Resources of Humanity Have to Be Called Up. Mankind Must Be the Immortal Species. Conference is happening over 2 days, November 13th and 14th. That's next Saturday and Sunday. And then for questions for Harley today, let me just say questions can be taken at questions@LaRoucheOrganization.com. I think we have a couple people now that have questions. So if that's the case, can we go to that platform? Hi.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're all right. Go ahead.
All right, yeah, I had a question. It's kind of like 2 parts, but I think they're connected. On the question of ideas, I was wondering if there's any advice on how do you help someone see an idea if they're kind of stuck mostly in a sense perception kind of way. And the second part that I think it connects to is what is there something of an electoral strategy that's thought about by the LaRouche organization? Just when referencing the 2000s push in the Democratic Party, it would seem like there's a bit of a gridlock and an impossibility of doing something like that. Now it seems like both parties have almost been inoculated to that kind of attempt through both the Sanders and the Trump campaigns. And I'm thinking in particular, I'm in the Scranton area, there's just a local news item between one Trumper candidate for Congress and a local editorial writer for the newspaper. And they finally got down and talked to each other after kind of slinging mud back and forth. And you could tell they're both from a similar position as when you're talking about Occupy and Tea Party at that time and how they see the mess of the current situation. But it seems like they're stuck in just fighting proxy wars in whatever the most current polarizing topic is, with mostly of the mindset, this is cynically what I have to do in order to prevent the other guy from making things worse. So what's a way to get from that mindset to one that can acknowledge an idea that produces a positive political vision? Thank you.
It's a very useful question. And I think the way to address that is to look at what I laid out in terms of the Virginia case. What's the irony in this? The irony is that the media did what you'd expect. They play this Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, suburbs versus the cities versus rural voters to try to perpetuate this myth that the Trump voter is a low education, low IQ reactionary, and that the liberals are effete snobs. Are there elements of truth to that? Well, really, at least on the liberal side, there are. But what's the irony here? The irony here is it has nothing to do with the standard political discussion in the media. If you look at what I laid out in terms of Youngkin's, the irony is that Trump voters voted for a guy who's part of the military-industrial complex responsible for the endless wars, the financial industry responsible for the endless bailouts and endless austerity, which were all denounced by Donald Trump in 2016. That's an irony. And that's something you can bring up when you say, how do you get an idea across? You have to go to a part of a person's thinking that exists with an ability to reflect on what they are saying. Most people will say things that they have tested with their friends, with their families, against whether they're online, internet, or Washington Post. Mostly people live in a bubble which reconfirms their prejudices. And the best way to get an idea into that is to show where what they're thinking doesn't exist in the real world. It's a so-called narrative. It's something that was created to keep them inside their bubble. And I think the Youngkin's case, maybe this will come out over the next weeks. Maybe it won't. We'll bring it out. I'm bringing it out. I just wrote an article on it because I think it's important that people realize that this was a classic con job. And then they say, well, was he really smart? Was this a smart strategy, not embracing Trump? Trump endorsed him. He thanked President Trump, but he didn't bring him in to campaign for him. And they say, oh, this was a really brilliant strategy by the Republican. Well, it was deliberate because he's not a Trump supporter. He's from the Bush machine. So this is one way that you can use irony. Another example of this is that the idea that there'll be money made available for poor countries that don't develop. Now, think about it. This was attacked by the president of Uganda, who said solar and wind as energy sources are enforcing poverty on Africa. Now, if you live in the United States, you're told solar and wind, that's the next generation, that's the next level, that's the cool thing, that's the best way to invest. But what does it really do? Where you have solar and wind in abundance in California and Texas, you had blackouts within the last year to 18 months. In Germany, we have skyrocketing energy prices, even with government subsidies for wind and solar. And in fact, it's been a very cold fall, very cold summer and autumn in Germany. Germany is here's the irony, Germany's canceling coal, canceling nuclear, and yet they're buying electricity from the Czech Republic and Poland, most of which comes from coal. So you can use these ironies to show people that what they're being told is fraudulent. But much more important is you've got to get people to recognize this idea that Helga has been really bringing up on the idea of the coincidence of opposites from Nicholas of Cusa. That the truth usually doesn't exist in the specific talking points that come from the different sides. There's a higher truth. There are principles. And the most important of these principles is the sanctity of human life. And by saying that, I don't just mean keeping people alive, but human life, meaning the ability to develop creative solutions, to exist in the cognitive realm. And this goes back to the importance of Vernadsky's conception of the noosphere, that it's ideas that actually move the physical universe. And these ideas are based on uncovering principles that were there at the time of the creation of the universe. They're embedded in the solar system and embedded in the vastness of space. They're there for us to discover. But you don't discover these ideas by looking through the senses. You discover it through hypothesis. And so I think, just to throw out these couple of points, irony is the most important, to me, weapon you use in organizing, because if you do it properly, you get people to laugh at how they've been played. And I think that's something that is greatly underestimated. And some of the best approaches to politics have been from, in some ways, comedians who are not afraid to bring these ironies up, even if they don't necessarily have the answers.
I don't know whether I guess the question is not there, but given what has just come up, what I want to do, Harley, is to introduce something and have you make a comment about it. Because what we're talking about here is what Linda LaRouche identified in terms of the subject of metaphor. And this is something that LaRouche was very passionate about getting across to everybody that he talked to, particularly, by the way, when he was incarcerated between 1989 and 94. So what we're going to do is play something which is from September 16th of 1975. This is from hearings going on in the United States Senate, which involved an investigation of the Central Intelligence Agency. The particulars of that we'll come to in a different video in just a few minutes as well. But there's a concept being discussed called plausible deniability, so-called concept. And this is Howard Baker talking to William Colby, head of CIA. We'll just bring that up now, and then we'll take Harley's comment. And I think people will see the connection with what has just been discussed.
I won't prolong my opportunity to examine the witness much longer, Mr. Chairman. I understand we're going to try to operate under the 10-minute rule. May I ask you only this further question then in general, Mr. Colby? You've heard of the doctrine of plausible deniability.
Yes, and I've rejected it now, Senator. I say that we cannot depend upon that anymore.
The question I was going to put to you, is that a phrase of art in the intelligence community? Does it have a separate significance that you understand?
It was a rationale used in earlier years.
What does it
mean? If the United States could deny something and not be clearly demonstrated as having said something falsely, then the United States could do so.
In the case of assassinations, in the case of any other domestic surveillance, in the case of the formulation of poisons, under that previous rationale, would the doctrine of plausible deniability have led the agency to destroy records, to conceal evidence, or to compartmentalize to the point where it would be a committee such as this later would have been unable to establish what really happened?
I think the plausible denial concept was used in the sense of international diplomatic relationships.
Are you saying by that it would not have applied to the formulation of toxic materials?
I would not say that it didn't have anything to do with it at all, but I think that the basic rationale for the doctrine of plausible denial was so that our nation could deny something and not be tagged with it.
Okay, so Harley, I'd like you to comment on what you just heard. And whether or not that was a plausibly deniable description of plausible deniability.
Well, here we go. Once again, we can pick up on the question of how plausible deniability really is best unmasked through the use of irony. Let me use an example. Christopher Steele and MI6 and the role they played in Russiagate. Now, here's where it becomes really interesting. Because if you look at the battleground, the so-called East-West battleground after the end of the Cold War, when there was an opportunity to get rid of NATO. I mean, what was the point of NATO? NATO was to defend Western Europe from the Warsaw Pact. When the Warsaw Pact dissolved, why keep NATO? Well, you had the importance of MI6 in setting up the endless wars through false flag operations, but most importantly, the direct intervention by Sir Richard Dearloffe into the United States with the dodgy dossier about Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction. Now, this was known to be a made-up story, and it was exposed by Joseph Wilson, by his wife, Valerie Plame, that the argument that Saddam was trying to buy yellow cake uranium from the country of Niger, that was a fraud. There are all kinds of indications that these things were frauds. Well, what did Colin Powell do? What did the Bush administration do? They took this dossier, which many of them knew was fake, about Saddam's ability to launch nuclear strikes or chemical weapons strikes, biological weapon strikes against London that would arrive within 40 minutes. So that was the line that was presented to the United Nations. And Powell showed these pictures of what I at the time called taco trucks in the Iraqi desert, saying that these were mobile weapon labs carrying these biological weapons, including anthrax, that were about to be unleashed on the West. Now, Powell gave that presentation. And according to Lawrence Wilkerson, his deputy, he was skeptical. And after it happened, he knew that it was a mistake. But did they ever fully get to the question of where did this come from? Why was it used? This is an example of plausible deniability. Well, they say, well, we knew Saddam was bad. We knew Saddam was behind the terrorists. All these lines, just as we saw again with Christopher Steele, who, by the way, was vetted by the same Sir Richard Dearloffe, who was his boss when Steele was with MI6. Dearloffe was no longer the head of MI6, but he used his contacts in the United States, including with networks around the FBI, to say that he was confirming that Steele's dossier was valid. And now this is coming up once again because of the indictments that seem to be coming out of the Durham investigation of people who were part of the whole Steele dossier to set up the FBI investigations. Now, is it plausibly deniable, that they were involved in corrupt fraud? No, it's not. The only thing about plausible deniability is when you have a media which is in on the lies, when you have a political establishment which is in on the lies, when you have a military industrial complex which manufactures the lies for the sake of scaring the hell out of the world to justify unbelievable defense budgets. I would say that's an example of how an irony can unwind what people would say is plausibly deniable. And I think what's interesting, I think that clip was from the Church Committee hearings back in the days when Democrats used to be skeptical about the CIA. And as you saw from that clip, Howard Baker, who was a Republican, was also very skeptical about the CIA. Unfortunately, we don't have that in the political universe anymore. People like John Brennan got away with lying. The whole crew of them, not just Russiagate, but in defending these wars. And just one other example quickly on this. Julian Assange. Isn't it an irony that someone who published the documents that demonstrate war crimes committed by the United States and NATO in Southwest Asia, that the man who published the documents that showed that those were war crimes is in prison, and the people who committed the war crimes are the ones insisting that he be brought to the United States to stand trial? Another irony that we should use to crack this line that's been put up about how this was a deliberate, by Assange, it was a commitment of an act of war against the United States.
I'll go right back for another question in just a moment. I have you there. I just want to make one observation in response to what you said, which is that in the year after that Church Committee, George Bush became the head of the CIA. His job was to clean up in various ways, the various inquiries that were going on against the CIA at that point. And that was essentially the case. They began to silence people in various ways. And that same George Bush, who then became the vice president of the United States, consolidated intelligence in the vice president's office through this what was called the Special Situation Group and through National Security Decision Directors number 3 and number 2. And from that platform, launched himself into the presidency of the United States. The past 20 years of American life, I would argue, have been a Bush process, inclusive of the Obama administration. I mean, I think that's something for people to think about. I'm not saying that we necessarily should go into that now, but rather than one cover-up after another, one war after another, one silly explanation for motivating American presence around the world after another. And is, I think it important, as you already said about the race in Virginia, which is the headquarters, I mean, that's the bedroom of many, multiple, not just American, but also British intelligence agencies and other, that we always think about these things in their actual strategic context, rather than this so-called Republican versus Democratic divide, non-existent divide. So next questioner, go right ahead.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, Harley. I had two questions. Hi. One is a report that I actually found. It was in an African news source in Ghana, and it was talking about their deputy energy minister. His name is Dr. Muhammad Amin Adam, and he had mentioned that the transition from hydrocarbon-based energy, from oil to natural gas, which was being pushed on Africa by the people in Glasgow, would be a serious misdirection in policy, and that if Africa was to develop properly, it would need low cost, high dense energy sources in order to sustain its population, to have a modern economy. And he pointed to the recent energy crisis in Europe, where you've already mentioned that the prices of electricity have soared because of this absurd transition from nuclear to renewables. And he said that we absolutely can't have this, and that the demand for hydrocarbons will be actually rising in the coming years, and Africa will need to make investments in this sector. So I wanted to get your response on that. And my other question has to do with mental health, especially among younger people in the United States, because there was this article that I saw in which a lot of college students in particular, they said that they were completely lost, and a majority of them were dropping out because they just didn't feel the motivation to actually continue. And you actually also see, as has been mentioned a lot, this problem of addiction among younger people with opiates and with other kinds of drugs. So with this coming conference, I'm wondering what intervention will we need to make to actually solve this crisis, this mental health crisis, this problem of drugs and of just pessimism among younger people? So those are my two questions.
Okay, good questions. Let's start with the one from Ghana, because I actually mentioned that in terms of what the president of Uganda said. There were also comments from President Buhari of Nigeria about how Africa needs nuclear and coal, coal-produced electricity. It's obvious. What was the whole point of the imperial policy toward Africa? The British, the French, the Dutch, the Belgian. It was to extract raw materials from virtual slave labor, to send in colonizers who would live in nice homes and would live off the proceeds of these things, while providing wealth to, at that time, the European countries. And Ghana is one of the important countries in trying to break free from that imperial policy. I believe one of the African leaders referred to this policy as carbon colonialism, the Glasgow policy. It is a form of colonialism because there's no way these countries will develop without, as you say, available, efficient, cheap electricity. You can't produce clean water without it. The ability to have an agricultural system that functions requires energy. The transportation that's required, I mean, Africa is a very large continent, and part of the colonial legacy is very little internal connection by useful forms of transport between the great cities, especially from the coasts to the inland areas. So what better way of enforcing colonialism than to say to the Africans, we'll give you a few dollars for carbon offsets if you don't develop your economy. Now, what happens, and here's another irony, what happens in a country which will not be given credit to develop coal-fired plants, fossil fuel plants, nuclear plants? How will people provide energy? They'll cut down forests. They'll burn wood. They'll burn biomass, which, according to people like Greta Thunberg, is unacceptable. So what are they left with? Freezing, starving. That's the policy. And so I think it's fairly clear to many of the people in nations of Africa that the future of the world is going to have to deal with the fact that the population of Africa will soon surpass that of Europe, of Asia, of North America. In some cases, it's already larger. And that the countries of Africa have large young populations that have not been damaged by the drug culture that you mentioned. And certainly because most of them don't have access to electricity and media, cell phones, that you don't have the same levels of video addiction and social media addiction. So there's an optimism in Africa. And you see it in Ghana. Ghana has a space program. So, I think this is the big problem that Prince Charles and Schwab and the Davos crowd have when it comes to Africa. How do you convince governments to impose policies that will keep their people literally in a form of colonial slavery? It's not going to work. And these are potential allies for those of us in the West who want to trash this whole model of neoliberalism and new imperialism in the form of these endless wars, and instead have cooperation, which is why China is so important, because China is in Africa and China is investing in these development programs. Now, this gets directly to the second question on mental health. What's the basis of mental health? It's a positive sense of self that you can play a role in shaping future history. When you're young, virtually anything seems possible. At least it was when I was young. I grew up during the very early years of NASA, the first space launch. I remember sitting in a classroom in West Virginia in third grade, watching John Glenn go up. You had this total excitement and enthusiasm for space travel among myself and all of my classmates. And when you ask people then, what do you want to be when you grow up? Some would say policemen, cowboys, but a lot of them said astronauts. A growing number of people said, I want to learn about space. Now, what happened shortly after that? The infusion of drugs, the mass importation of drugs, the rock, sex, drug counterculture, which shifted people's, and the Vietnam War, which shifted people's identity away from this look into the universe and what was called the extraterrestrial imperative. Instead, people started meditating, looking into their belly buttons, thinking that you find truth through LSD trips and so on. And having gone through that part of the culture, those of us who joined with Lyndon LaRouche not only rejected it, but made it our business to find out where this was coming from. And we did an extensive series of reports that ended up in books called Dope Incorporated, which showed that this was the same people who ran the colonial policy, who were using drugs. Actually, the same people who ran the opium war against China for the same reason were using drugs to dope up the American population. So if you're told that the world may end in 18 months unless you're willing to give up cars and electricity and eating meat, and that there's no hope for the future, unless you're one of the children of the oligarchy, it is profoundly depressing. And then if your sense of identity is shaped by how many likes you get for a post you do on Twitter or Instagram, then you can see how you've been totally captured. You know, one form of addiction, there's drug addiction, but I think that the other thing we're going to be looking at, and by the way, we're going to do more kind of an update on Dope Incorporated, on who's behind this and what its effect is in destroying the cognitive processes. This is something that you know, in the 60s, people were studying and knew that if you were addicted to drugs, the ability to develop your mind was lost. You know, but the whole argument from people like Aldous Huxley and others is no, you're opening up a whole new area of consciousness through drug addiction, through drug usage. And you combine that with the idea that there's not going to be a future that you hear from Greta Thunberg, Al Gore, and others, and that the only thing you can really hope for is some form of sensual gratification from sex or entertainment from social networking, reassurance from social networking. I think that's the nexus point of the decline of mental health. Now, add to that as part of the austerity policy, we've shut down mental hospitals. We've turned the field of psychiatry and psychology into how to cope with depression, as opposed to what is a healthy mental attitude, a healthy self-image that goes along with mental health. So I think these are important questions, and we will be discussing them. The fourth panel at the upcoming conference will be on this question of culture. And I think the economic panel will take up this question of the new drug wars. So we'll definitely be discussing these topics on the 13th and 14th of November.
Yeah, just to say that is the case. On the second panel on Saturday next week, 2 p.m., the panel will address the motives behind the Great Reset, the Nazi economist Hjalmar Schacht, Afghanistan and Haiti, the global role of London's Dope Incorporated, the need for a world health system. All of those things will be discussed. I want to also just take this as an opportunity to maybe deepen this conversation a little bit more past what the questioner just asked, because I think we should stay on it for a bit. It's something that a lot of people talk about, something that a lot of people are very concerned about. And particularly the COP26 thing is an expression of mental instability, primarily. And several people stayed home because they weren't crazy. And they weren't prepared to go to a conference where crazy people wearing crazy uniforms called royalty were going to be lecturing them about what their nations were supposed to do. The very same people whose ancestors and they were responsible for more deaths intentionally than any other force in human history. So here's a few items just to take, or rather, not just items, but I think I just want to introduce something. Some people are aware that apparently yesterday down in Houston there was this Astro World Music Festival, I guess it was, where 8 people were killed and hundreds were hurt during some sort of stampede. Not entirely clear exactly what happened. But this is not an unusual event any longer in the United States. People remember the Country and Western Festival in Las Vegas, where over 50 people were killed. And then you take other things, and people say, oh, no, well, one thing is not the same as the other. Well, here's the problem. You have a frequency of these incidents, in the case of the United States, in which any one of them 4 decades ago or so would have been the cause for a major national discussion. Now they just happen as a headline. But there's a reason I believe that we have to also go to, which is the character of leadership and the way in which the misleadership of a nation over time creates a form of mental instability in the population at large. Because the actual culture itself, that is the culture of physical economy, the non-productive nature of the United States, for example, today, where less than 15% of the workforce is actually involved in productive labor, whereas back in, let's say, 1966, approximately 55% of the nation, these are people who are doing it mining, manufacturing, or agriculture, or things related to it. Now we have a population which is fundamentally not productive as a workforce. People don't like to acknowledge that because they don't want to be told that what they do isn't a real work. And that's why you get terms like the casino industry or the prostitution industry or the video game industry. Industries used to produce actual physical, tangible product. Now they produce disease and psychosis, but they're all considered to be industry. I wanted to note, Harley, you referenced several times Terry McAuliffe. Well, 17 years ago, Lyndon LaRouche, speaking about him in 2004, had this to say about Terry McAuliffe. He said, Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic National misleader, because he was then, McAuliffe was then the head of the DNC, Democratic National Committee. Terry McAuliffe knows he's a liar. He sent out letters all over the place, messages all over the place saying that I'm an anti-Semite and a racist. He's a liar. The man is morally unfit to hold any public office in the United States. He is not fit to be seen in public. He should wear a mask from henceforth. That wasn't because he had COVID, because he should be wearing a mask, period. And he went on to then say, now all of those others who have consented to go along with him, they also know that he's a liar, and yet their behavior toward me and toward my campaign is based on what they know to be a lie. They are unfit to be candidates for the president of the United States. Now, this is a critical element of what has happened in American life. From the period of 1986 in particular, when the raid was made on Lyndon LaRouche and his associates down in Leesburg, Virginia, in the United States, there has been a perpetrated lie for 35 years. Not merely concerning the person of Lyndon LaRouche, which is one thing, but the political process in the United States and the way it was actually working. Because what Lyndon LaRouche was doing, besides what he successfully did with the Reagan administration with the SDI, he was also exposing the role of the vice president of the United States, then George Bush, and not only in what was called the crack cocaine process, which was only one element of Bush's, many crimes. But the entire sort of process of decomposition of nations using assassination and all sorts of other methods, which were in fact illegal, criminal, and were crimes against humanity. Now, that same George Bush, let's remember, was given a funeral in which multiple presidents showed up. Donald Trump did not attend, all talking about the wonderful George Bush. You cannot have a nation in which there is sanity when that kind of thing is perpetrated. This process, however, didn't start 17 years ago, and it didn't start during the period of the Iraq War. It didn't even start in that sense, but more, it's something that was also addressed by the church committee. And I'd like to do the following, and here's why I'm doing this. The baby boomer generation was terrorized by assassinations, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy earlier. Some of you know that in recent days, in fact, the Biden administration gave another excuse for, once again, not releasing the Kennedy files. So once again, we've now gone over 60 years, essentially, without being able, or nearly 60 years, without being able to have files shown to the country about the true nature of the Kennedy assassination. And we're always told it's national security. The clip I'm going to show you, the reason we're going to put this up now is because it shows the demoralization of the American people in the aftermath of Watergate, and how the reason for that was that there was a sense in which the intelligence agencies had gone completely out of control. And after we do this, I'll ask for Harley's comment. We have a final questioner, and then we'll be closing out. But I think it's invaluable to take a look at this in order to understand why so many Americans are now crazy, and why they often have crazy theories about what the United States government is doing, even if those theories may have had some basis in the correct suspicion about what the United States government does. But there's a reason that people have become so divided and crazy. Take a look.
After 5 months of closed-door investigation, of talking in private with intelligence agents and officials, most of the senators now agree with Chairman Frank Church that the CIA has indeed been a rogue elephant out of control. So the testimony of Colby didn't allay the suspicions. The hearings took place in the historic Senate caucus room, scene of the dramatic Watergate investigation just 2 years ago. The press was back in great numbers today, but not the public. There were, in fact, no long lines, and the seats reserved for the audience were at times only 2/3 filled. As someone said, after what has happened in this country during the past 2 years, there are no more future shocks. But whether there are shocks or not, today's open hearing did focus major attention on the way the CIA has gone about its business in the United States.
The subject today concerns CIA's involvement in the development of bacteriological warfare materials with the Army's biological laboratory at Fort Detrick, CIA's retention of an amount of shellfish toxin, and CIA's use and investigation of various chemicals and drugs. The relationship between the CIA and the Army Biological Laboratory at Fort Detrick as an activity requiring further investigation surfaced in late April of this year. It resulted from information provided by a CIA officer not directly associated with the project in response to my repeated directives that all past activities which might now be considered questionable be brought to the attention of agency management. Information provided by him and by 2 other officers aware of the project indicated that the project at Fort Detrick involved the development of bacteriological warfare agents, some lethal, and associated delivery systems suitable for clandestine use. A search was made for any records or other information available on the project. This search produced information about the basic agreement between the Army and the CIA relating to the project and some limited records covering its activities from its beginning in 1952 to its termination in 1970. In the course of the investigation, CIA's laboratory storage facilities were searched, and about 11 grams, a little less than half an ounce, of shellfish toxin and 8 milligrams of cobra venom were discovered in a little-used, vaulted storeroom in an agency building. Both of these middle-grade officers agree that no one, including their immediate superior, was told of the retention of the shellfish toxin.
If that amount of shellfish toxin were administered orally, which is one of the least efficient ways for administering it in terms of its lethality, that quantity was sufficient to kill at least 14,000 people. If it were administered with the sophisticated equipment that was found in the laboratory, that quantity would be sufficient to kill a great many more. Estimates vary upwards into the hundreds of thousands. Now, my first question is, why did the agency prepare a shellfish toxin for which there is no practical antidote, which attacks the nervous system and brings on death very quickly? Why did the agency prepare toxins of this character in quantities sufficient to kill many thousands of people? What was the need for that in the first place, long before the presidential order came down to destroy this material?
I think the first part of the answer to that question, Mr. Chairman, is the fact that the L pill, which was developed during World War II, does take some time to work and is particularly agonizing to the subject who uses it. Some of the people who would be natural requesters of such a capability for their own protection and the protection of their fellow agents really would not want to face that kind of a fate. But if they could be given an instantaneous one, they would accept that. And that was the thought process behind developing the capability. Now, I cannot explain why that quantity was developed, except that this was a collaboration that we were engaged in with the United States Army, and we did develop this particular weapon, you might say, as a for possible use. Now, when CIA retained the amount that it did, it obviously did it improperly.
This quantity and the various devices for administering the toxin that were found in the laboratory certainly make it clear that purely defensive uses were not what the agency was limited to in any way. There were definite offensive uses. In fact, there were dart guns. You mentioned suicides. Well, I don't think a suicide is usually accomplished with a dart, particularly a gun that can place the dart in a human target in such a way that he doesn't even know that he's been hit.
There's no question about it. It was also for offensive reasons. No question.
Have you brought with you some of those devices which would have enabled the CIA to use this poison for?
We have indeed.
For killing people? Don't point it at me. I wonder if
can you roll that over?
Roll it over. Now, does this pistol fire the dart?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chairman. The round thing at the top is obviously the sight. The rest of it is what is practically a normal 45, although it's special. However, it works by electricity. There's a battery in the handle, and it fires a small dart.
So that when it fires silently?
Almost silently, yes. Very little.
What range does it have?
100 meters. 100 meters, I believe, about 100 yards, 100 meters.
About 100 meters range.
Right.
And the dart itself, when it strikes the target, does the target know that he's been hit and about to die?
That depends, Mr. Chairman, on the particular dart used. There are different kinds of these flechettes that were used in various weapon systems, and a special one was developed which potentially would be able to enter the target without perception.
Without perception?
Right.
And did you find such darts in the library, in the laboratory?
We did.
Yes. Isn't it true too that the effort not only involved designing a gun that could strike a human target without knowledge of the person who'd been struck, but also the toxin itself would not appear in the autopsy?
Well, there was an attempt.
Or the dart?
Yes, so that there was no way of perceiving that the target was hit.
As a murder instrument, that's about as efficient as you can get, isn't it?
It is a weapon, a very serious weapon.
So this is 1976. This is 1975, 46 years ago. And I would submit to you that people were not showing up for that hearing because they didn't want to be identified by any agency as being possibly in opposition, precisely because it had become the case that they were so terrified by their own government. And the fact that they could not get to the bottom and were not allowed to get to the bottom of various of the assassinations, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, that they began to plausibly deny reality. And that things like virtual reality and the other things that have been talked about for the last 20 years actually come out of a period in which the United States population was itself being driven insane. And that things like the social media, the things like the drug process, the other things that have been happening, much of it under the watchful eye of George Bush and his family, have been the characteristic of American life from about 1976, when he was head of CIA for about a year through the period of his various administrations or incarnations in various administrations. And of course, Lyndon LaRouche was an arch enemy of Bush, having played a very important role, Lyndon LaRouche having played a very important role in preventing him from achieving the Republican Party nomination for president in 1980. So that the process that we've seen of cultural decomposition should not be divorced from looking at it from the standpoint not merely that leaders drove the people crazy, no, but the people's denial of what they had to confront. For example, the way in which Lyndon LaRouche was denied, the way in which people don't associate with Lyndon LaRouche, the way in which people go into Wikipedia or they go into some other platform and they look up whatever is said about Lyndon LaRouche and say, oh, we have to stay away from him. Something that has been, also still in existence to this day, and his movement become important in terms of the mental health, literally the mental health of the United States. The events of January 6th, the way in which the population, 70 million plus people, were essentially being branded as domestic terrorists, potentially, and other such things cannot be understood as phenomena associated with an election, a particular candidate like Donald Trump. There is no way to understand that. That is a process that has gone on over several decades. And I think it was important to just indicate that. Harley, you may have a comment at this point. If not, we have a final question, I think, for you. But if you want to have anything to say about this, go right ahead.
Well, what occurs to me in looking at that is this question we've been talking about in terms of the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, depraved indifference. The idea that people can be confronted with policies that are designed to kill people. In this case, one person with a poison dart. In the case of refusing to unfreeze the funds for Afghan relief that can target 4 million children. The fact that we killed 500,000 Iraqi children in the mid-90s when Madeleine Albright and the Clinton administration carried out an embargo against Iraq, which did not allow medicine or money for food to get to the people there. And the estimate was 500,000 children died. Now, this is where you see the disconnect between people who assert their belief in the sanctity of human life and turning away from actions that are necessary based on narratives. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. If the whole purpose of the climate change summit in Glasgow is to save lives, because allegedly there's going to be climate change that will lead to flooding, lead to worse weather, all these other stories that will kill large numbers of people. What about the people today who are threatened with death this winter in Afghanistan, for example, because of the withholding of funds? The children in Yemen who are being starved by the US sanctions. Children and others in Syria who face death because of the sanctions. Where is the concern about that? Why was there no talk about that in Glasgow? Because it's a fraud. And these kinds of frauds cause people to look at at things that they think immediately affect them and not at the policies that are being implemented in their name. And I think this is this question of depraved indifference. If in fact we live in societies where we can turn our back on these kinds of things, or we can accept what happened, for example, that you brought up in Houston, the 8 people minimally who died as a result of a stampede at a rock concert. Is this getting back to normal? The fact that we can now have concerts and we can now have these kinds of events. You have to ask yourself, what has happened to human culture, to the idea that we have a responsibility to our fellow man, that we have to have empathy for others. Doesn't mean we have to agree with their system or with what they do. but that we recognize as human beings they have certain inalienable rights, as we so proudly say in our founding documents. Inalienable rights, including that of the general welfare. So I think this gets to this question of the deeper immorality that dominates the society. And we know that people want to escape that, want to break with that. That's why people voted in 2016 to keep Hillary Clinton out of the presidency. Probably that's why a lot of people in Virginia voted against Terry McAuliffe. But these kinds of negative affirmations are not adequate. We need to get to this idea of what must be done for mankind as a whole. And the whole principle of the American Revolution was to defeat the principle of empire and to establish economic policies and policies of protection of life that are in coherence with the wonderful Declaration of Independence and the preamble to our Constitution. And so, I think we have to hold these up, and the function of statesmen in the past. And as you point out, that there were many, many people in the United States who knew Lyndon LaRouche was not guilty of anything he was charged with. And yet they stood aside and let him go to prison for 5 years and let the lies stand against him. So, it's not to scold everyone, but to say, look, we have to do better. And one of the ways to change that is to become an active participant in the events that we're holding that have as their intention to give back to people in the United States and Western Europe and around the world this concept that we can act for our own self-interest by acting for the interests of everyone. And that's how I'd respond to that.
Okay, very good. Thanks. And so we have the last question. Go right ahead.
Hi, this is Jose here in the Bronx. After watching that clip of the church committee and seeing what the CIA has done, I looked up what was the aftermath of that. What was the result of that? And one of the things that President Ford did was he started an executive order that said no employee of the government should participate in killing any other foreign leaders or anyone of another government. But Senator Church didn't like this because he said, well, any other president can just revoke that executive order. So what did Senator Church want done? And what do you do when something like that is even exposed? And then my second question is, is the truth enough to spur real change and action, not just in individuals, but as a whole? Because we've seen that Snowden has exposed that the NSA still spies on people today. And yet nothing has really come. I know we just had a court case where the NSA can't look at phone call logs anymore. But, and this may be just a fault of mine as an organizer, because when I tell somebody what's going on, they say, wow, okay, well, what next? What do I do? Oh, well, to be honest, I sometimes do get stumped. And this is just something that I'm admitting here, and I would like to know what is next. How do you spur change in someone after they've been brought out of the cave? And lastly, I guess, what is the function of intelligence in a time of peace? I can't imagine you'd have countries spying on each other using their intelligence agencies in a time when you want mutual cooperation. So what role can an FBI or CIA serve that's not about killing other governments and leaders? So I'll leave it there.
Well, each of these questions tonight, Dennis, have been orienting toward getting to much more profound conceptions. And your last question, I'm just going to leave, Jose, because the whole idea of what's involved in intelligence, Lyndon LaRouche had a very specific idea of intelligence, and he wrote a couple papers of what should be a curriculum for developing intelligence agents and intelligence institutions. And I think the main point he made in that is that as long as you have empires, as long as you have people who are committed to their own preservation against others, you do need to have intelligence, but it has to be based on the fight for these higher principles. And so, that's something that we can discuss more. And I think, again, that comes out of the idea of, can we establish a community of principle among sovereign nations? And an intelligence operation or community would be employed to make sure that anyone who would do damage to that could be caught in the act. On the question of the first questions you were raising, my basic assessment, and I think this is what Lyndon had always emphasized, is that the truth is a power in itself. And had Snowden not done what he did, how much worse would the situation be? How much more spying? How much more assassinations would be going on? I just want to say one thing on this assassination question. According to executive orders, presidents and governments are not supposed to assassinate other people. And when Mike Pompeo was asked, did you have a plan to assassinate Assange? And I think it's indisputable that he did, as was reported in this Yahoo News article. Pompeo said, oh, we don't assassinate people. Well, what about Soleimani? He bragged about assassinating the Iranian Revolutionary Guard leader. So the hearings from the Church Committee are not just a thing of the past, because they're still carrying out these kinds of operations. Now, is the truth enough? Well, I think I always cite this Yiddish proverb, the truth never dies, but it lives an awful life. We have to fight for truth and get other people to not just repeat the truths that we discover, but develop their own capabilities to be truth-seeking people. And if you inspire a love of mankind around this importance of seeking the truth and living truthful lives, or you could say, as Lyndon LaRouche would say, principled lives based on uncovering the principles that govern the physical universe and nature, that also should govern the behavior of man toward his fellow man. That if you make that your practice and organize with that, you do inspire others to act. With all the slanders and attacks on Lyndon LaRouche over all the years, why is he still such an important figure internationally? Because people recognized in him a truth teller who is willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of getting the truth out to as widely as possible. And if you have more people like that, who are not just spokespeople for the truth, but who are committed to the truth on the level Lynn was, of discovering the principles which underlie the harmonies of the universe, and make that your goal of your life, you inspire in others this desire this scorn for those such as Prince Charles and Sir Richard Dearloffe and people like Steve Bannon and Brennan and those. You develop a kind of immunization process in the population so they no longer accept these things. And you could say people don't accept what they're hearing from the mainstream news, except they still use it to shape their prejudices. And getting above those prejudices, this is what Helga's talking about with the coincidence of opposites. Recognizing that there are higher dynamics that define what is true and how we should live. So let me leave it at that. I think that's what I'd like to say.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Harley. And I want to thank everybody for being on, and to also particularly the questioners. If you did send us any other questions, we'll try to answer them. That was at questions@LaRoucheOrganization.com. And we want to make sure, again, that you all will join us for the conference, register for the conference, and be involved in it. I'd like to do something in the closing. And in this case, I want to respond in part to what Jose was asking by pointing out the following. And this is for everybody that is interested in being on the next week's conference. The conference has 4 panels, and those panels have been listed. You'll hear it again. We'll actually be playing in our outro a little advertisement that will go through each panel. The last panel is called The Beauty of True Human Culture. Now, often people think that this panel is either less important or way, way different than the other panels, which are on strategy and science of physical economy and science as people think about it. But to answer Helga, the question that Jose asked about intelligence and how you would handle it and whether or not truth is enough. The person that you'd have to ask that question to get a best answer would be Helga LaRouche, because the most advanced intelligence ever devised came from Friedrich Schiller, the playwright. If you read his stories, particularly things like The Ghost Seer or The Sport of Destiny, these things, it becomes very clear how he thinks about it, because they are relentless and ruthless. But his ideas about the aesthetic education of man make him thought about as being this highly idealistic person, which he was, but he understood something. He understood that if you take a look at something like Dante's Commedia, the 3-part Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso a poem, that Dante is identifying the tragedy of Florence, the tragedy of there was no Italy at the time. Italy was composed of city-states. And he's trying to describe the tragedy of his time, a tragedy that will essentially depopulate that city and the entirety of Europe, shortly after Dante's death, which was 700 years ago in 1321. People think it's just a poem. They don't get it. They don't get that what he's doing is he's identifying the delusions of the reader to the reader. So the fundamental thing in intelligence is that you have to get rid of your own delusions. It's not about whether you're killing people or not killing people or something like that. And the greatest intelligence agents in history have been, for example, musicians like Mozart or Bach. Take, for example, Bach's work, The Musical Offering. Bach is given a theme called the royal theme. And the challenge is that there are 6 different types of human voice: soprano, mezzo-soprano, alto, tenor, baritone, bass. And the idea is, can you improvise a piece of music? And you just sit down and make up a piece of music that will incorporate all 6 species of human voice into a single composition where each one of those voices is freely moving, but at the same time, it's one. Because if you can do that, you have identified or expressed in that instance true, complete human freedom. Bach does that. Bach does it, and he writes it out, and he writes out the implications of it, and he looks at the different challenges and the different hidden possibilities. That's intelligence work, because if you can do that, then you can see the flaws in the human mind in ways that your enemy cannot even fathom. The concept here is that humanity is fundamentally creative, and those who try to rule humanity on the basis of that which is not creative, that which is bestial. And that's usually some form of decree or mandates and commands, which are arbitrary or seen by the citizenry as arbitrary. The issue of what we write, whether it's in our publications like our individual newspapers, our pamphlets, or the Executive Intelligence Review, or the many books that were written, or the reason that Lyndon LaRouche will stand in front of an audience and talk for 2 hours, as he did back in 1998 in the segment we showed, and try to talk to people about how the Greeks worked and how they thought of ideas and what advanced conceptions in science and technology are. The reason he'll do that, and it didn't matter to him what the educational background of the person was, is because he knew that each individual is fundamentally creative. And that means that ideas can be assimilated if that individual's creativity is turned on. That is the issue of intelligence. An intelligence agency would be an agency whose job would be to access the fundamental, the frontiers of human creativity, to then reproduce that as a proof of principle, to then be able to generalize that, whether that's in the form of an actual technology, such as something like thermonuclear fusion, or whether that's by means of a principle of diplomacy, which is the kind of thing that Helga LaRouche has recently done, particularly with her Operation Ibn Sina idea attached to her original idea around the international health platform. This is a very specific application of the concept of diplomacy to Southwest Asia, intended to replace the 40 plus years of decadence, depopulation, and destruction that Bush, Brzezinski, the British intelligence placed in that area, which is what we're right now actually talking about in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, et cetera. Now, the fact that people want it to be dumb, the fact that people want it to be simplistic, the fact that people want it so that it's bite-sized is the tragedy. And that's what perpetuates these things. That's why we live in a world right now where COVID may destroy us all, and we would be morally unfit to stop that from happening. And we want to think about that. We want to think about how we might change our ways. And this is the issue of the conference. And so we want everybody to join us. The conference is called All Moral Resources of Humanity Have to Be Called Up. Mankind Must Be the Immortal Species. And we want to thank you all for joining us today. As I said, you're going to see again an announcement about the conference as we conclude. The conference will be happening exactly next week, starting at 10 a.m. And for more information, you'll just follow the directions that will be given to you now. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, I want to thank you all for listening to us, and we'll see you next week here for the Schiller Institute Conference, November 13th.